I wasn't looking for impossible biology frozen in stone. I was actually just researching the mundane logistical ledgers of European marble quarries in the 18th and 19th centuries. I was looking at the shipping manifests of Carrara, the documented weight limits of period wagons, and the breaking strain of hemp ropes. I wanted to understand the sheer arithmetic of moving multi-ton blocks of raw, unblemished crystalline rock down unpaved mountainsides using nothing but wooden carts and exhausted draft animals. It was supposed to be a straightforward study of pre-industrial supply chains and labor logistics. But as I traced the origin points of these massive stones to their final destinations in the grand galleries of the world, I started looking closer at the high-resolution archival photographs of the finished pieces. And I mean truly looking at them. I zoomed in on the scans of pieces like the Veiled Christ, the Rape of Proserpina, and the anonymous figures guarding forgotten municipal buildings. And what I saw there broke my understanding of material science. The official narrative is simple, neat, and contained. We are told that solitary men, armed with nothing more than iron chisels, wooden mallets, and immense patience, chipped away at solid blocks of limestone until they revealed absolute perfection. We are taught to accept this as a triumph of historical artistry, a testament to human determination that we simply cannot replicate today. But when you strip away the romanticism, ignore the placards in the museums, and look at the actual physics of the material, the official explanation collapses. It becomes a mathematical contradiction. Look at the archival photograph on your screen. Let the camera pan slowly down the torso. Notice the way the fingers of the hand press deeply into the soft tissue of the thigh. See how the skin bulges slightly around the grip, how the underlying muscle seems to react to the external pressure, how the fat dimples under the force. Now I want you to think about the tool that supposedly created this. A chisel. A blunt force instrument striking a highly fragile, brittle crystalline structure. Marble is notoriously unforgiving. One microscopic miscalculation in the angle of the strike, one fraction of an ounce of excess force, and the stone fractures along its natural fault lines. You cannot hammer a piece of solid stone into a state of pliability. You cannot strike rock and create the illusion of a pulse. Zoom in closer on the veil draped over the face of this figure. Notice the translucency. The stone is so thin that it appears to breathe, clinging to the contours of the nostrils and the lips beneath it. In some places, the marble is less than a millimeter thick, suspended in the air like woven silk, complete with embroidered edges. How do you carve the negative space beneath a millimeter-thick sheet of brittle stone without shattering it? The vibration alone from a hammer strike would pulverize that delicate web into dust. It is a physical impossibility. The tools of the era were mathematically and physically incapable of producing this level of surgical precision. Look at the ropes binding the wrists of some of these figures. The tension in the twisted fibers is captured so perfectly that you can almost hear the strain. Look at the tears pooling in the corners of eyes caught mid-fall. A chisel cannot carve a liquid droplet resting lightly on a cheek. The subtractive method of sculpture, removing what is not the statue, cannot account for the dynamic, living tension we see here. And yet, there it is, staring back at us. The more I stared at these archival images, the more a deeply unsettling feeling washed over me. I began to look at the pores, the faint suggestion of capillaries beneath the surface, the tension in the tendons. This is not the representation of life. This looks like life that was instantly, violently halted. The precision is not artistic. It is anatomical. It is an unsettling precision that completely defies the subtractive process of carving. What if we have been misinterpreting the evidence right in front of our eyes? We are told these are statues, masterworks of a bygone era. But when you look at the sheer biological accuracy, the impossible rendering of fluid dynamics, and soft tissue and solid rock, you have to ask a different question. Are we looking at art, or are we looking at an anomaly of altered matter? Are we looking at the petrified remnants of the Tartarian world? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The marble stops looking like carved rock and starts looking like frozen time. The silence of these figures is deafening. They stand in our museums, stripped of their true context, presented as parlor tricks of historical geniuses. But the physical evidence tells a story of a technology, or a cataclysm, that we are not allowed to understand. If you are finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe to keep this research alive. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Have you noticed these anomalies in your own streets? Let us look closely at the logistical ledgers and the sheer arithmetic of the official narrative. We are told that a single man, perhaps with a handful of unnamed apprentices, dragged a block of Carrara marble weighing upwards of 15 to 20 tons out of a mountain. We are expected to believe they lowered this massive, fragile crystalline structure down steep, unpaved inclines, using nothing but hemp ropes, wooden sledges, and animal labor. Think about the mechanical stress. Think about the breaking strain of natural fibers and the friction coefficients of greased wood on jagged rock. The math does not add up. A single slip, a momentary lapse in tension, and the stone shatters, rendering months of labor entirely void. Yet the history books ask us to accept this miracle of primitive logistics as a routine occurrence, repeated thousands of times across the continent to supply the world with perfect monumental art. And let us revisit the roads. The official record describes the 18th and 19th centuries as eras of unpaved, deeply rutted dirt and mud thoroughfares. We are asked to believe that wagons, rolling on wooden wheels reinforced with crude iron bands, carried these colossal blocks across hundreds of miles of primitive terrain. The mechanical reality of a wooden axle bearing that much localized weight, while simultaneously absorbing the kinetic shock of cobblestones, ruts, and craters, dictates immediate catastrophic failure. The axles would shatter into splinters. The wheels would sink to the hubs and lock in the earth. The sheer logistical infrastructure required to reliably transport just one of these raw blocks simply did not exist in the capacity that conventional history claims. Once the stones supposedly arrived at the workshop, the true mathematical contradiction begins. Consider the surface area of a complex, life-sized figure entangled in a net or draped in a diaphanous veil. The official narrative claims that a sculptor spent 3, maybe 4 years chipping away at this block. Break down the timeline. Calculate the number of hammer strikes required to remove thousands of pounds of negative space, using primitive iron tools. We are talking about millions of individual impacts. Every single strike carries the inherent risk of structural failure. If the subtractive method is true, then the sculptor had to execute millions of precise, forceful impacts without making a single catastrophic error. There is no eraser for marble. You cannot glue a shattered limb back onto a masterpiece. The error rate required to produce works like the Veiled Christ with a chisel is absolute zero. Human hands, operating hand tools by candlelight or natural daylight, do not possess a 0% error rate over a span of years. It is a logistical and physiological impossibility. Consider the sculpture known as Il Disengano, or the release from deception. Look at the high-resolution archival images of the intricate knotted net draped over the struggling figure. The official narrative demands that we believe a man took a solid block of marble and somehow carved the empty air out from between the ropes, leaving a free-hanging, mathematically perfect knotted net made of brittle stone. Try to visualize the logistics of that. How do you sand the inside of a marble knot? How do you apply pressure to a rasp or a file on a suspended millimeter-thick piece of stone? without the sheer torque, snapping it instantly. The physical tension required to polish the inner curves of that net would far exceed the tensile strength of the material itself. And what of the material science? Marble is a metamorphic rock composed of recrystallized carbonate minerals. It is hard, yes, but it is also exceptionally brittle. When you strike it with iron, you send shockwaves through the crystalline lattice. This inevitably creates microfractures. Yet when modern engineers and material scientists examine the impossibly thin folds of the marble veils, or the suspended ropes carved entirely of stone, they find no evidence of impact fracturing. How do you remove the bulk mass of the stone surrounding a delicate protrusion without the concussive force destroying the very detail you are trying to preserve? You cannot. The tools dictate the limits of the medium. The official explanation insists that the medium simply surrendered to the genius of the artist. But physics does not bow to romanticism. Look at the anatomical rendering. I want you to truly look at the way the skin folds over the collarbone, the way the Achilles tendon stretches under the weight of a shifting stance. A sculptor, no matter how gifted, is an observer approximating reality. They carve what they think they see. But the figures we call statues do not possess the approximations of art. They possess the exactitude of biology. If you examine the vascular system pulsing beneath the marble skin of these figures, you will find it is entirely asymmetrical, perfectly mapping the complex, chaotic pathways of a real human circulatory system. They possess an unsettling precision that goes far beyond aesthetic choice. The bone structure beneath the sculpted flesh implies a profound, inherent presence of internal human anatomy that cannot be achieved by merely hacking away at a rock. It looks as though the organic matter itself underwent a sudden, catastrophic phase change. Where are the ledgers of failure? Where are the mountains of ruined blocks? The half-finished torsos abandoned because a single strike of the mallet went a millimeter too deep? The archives are remarkably silent on the spectacular failures that must inevitably accompany such a high-risk, fragile endeavor. The funding required to finance these massive logistical operations, to feed the labor force, to transport the stone, and to absorb the cost of unavoidable mistakes would bankrupt empires. Yet these figures appear in our history fully formed, perfect, and inexplicably abundant. The silence is deafening. This brings us to a terrifying, yet mathematically sound conclusion. What if the timeline we have been sold is a fabrication designed to explain the inexplicable? We must consider the inheritance theory. The hypothesis that the society of the 18th and 19th centuries, the people with horse-drawn wagons, muddy streets, and iron chisels, did not create these impossible objects. We did not build this world. We found it. We stumbled into the ruins of a highly advanced, aesthetically superior global civilization, a society that possessed an understanding of frequency, resonance, and material manipulation that we cannot even fathom. We are like hermit crabs scuttling across the ocean floor, finding the discarded, magnificent shells of a much larger, more complex organism. We climb inside these empty architectural and artistic marvels. We occupy them, and we have the audacity to claim we grew them ourselves. The men we call master sculptors were not creators. They were discoverers. They were the curators of the petrified remains of the Tartarian epoch. They found these figures, perhaps buried in the mud or locked in the sealed chambers of forgotten cathedrals, cleaned the debris from their unblinking eyes, and chiseled their own names into the pedestals. If we accept that these are not statues, but the victims of a localized or global reset, a weaponized event or atmospheric catastrophe that instantly transmuted biology into stone, then the impossible logistics suddenly vanish. The 0% error rate makes sense because there was no carving. The surgical precision of the anatomy makes sense because it was once a living, breathing being. We have inherited a graveyard of masterpieces, and the official narrative is merely the blanket thrown over the evidence to keep us from asking the most dangerous questions. Let us move beyond the isolated masterpieces locked inside the climate-controlled vaults of European museums. If this anomaly, this impossible biological transmutation of flesh into solid stone, was limited to a single workshop in Italy or France, we could perhaps dismiss it as an extreme, unrepeatable freak of historical genius. We could force ourselves to believe the official narrative, but the pattern does not stop at the borders of the Mediterranean. It does not stop in the 18th century. When you begin to look at the architectural and sculptural inheritance scattered across the entire realm, from the forgotten municipal buildings of the American Midwest to the grand, crumbling cemeteries of South America and the monolithic facades of Eastern Europe, the official timeline shatters. The pattern repeats. Look at the monumental cemeteries, the Recoleta in Buenos Aires, Staglieno in Genoa, or Highgate in London. Let your eyes trace the rows of grieving angels, the veiled widows draped over tombs, the forgotten dignitaries staring blindly into the distance. We are told these were commissioned by local grieving families and executed by regional artisans using the same crude chisels and mallets. Yet the exact same impossible biological exactitude is present. Look at the way the granite and marble mimic the exact draping of heavy wool soaked in rain. Notice the precise tension in the muscles of the hands gripping the stone wreaths. Granite is exponentially harder and more unforgiving than marble. It does not yield to delicate rendering. It shatters and flakes. You cannot carve the microscopic texture of human skin, or the delicate, translucent folds of a weeping veil into granite using 19th century hand tools. If we are to believe the history books, an army of master sculptors, all possessing a 0% error rate and an unparalleled, superhuman grasp of anatomy, emerged simultaneously across multiple continents. They all independently developed the ability to defy the physical limitations of their tools and their chosen mediums, producing millions of these figures in a span of a few decades. And then, just as suddenly, they vanished from the historical record, leaving no comprehensive ledgers, no mountains of failed prototypes, and no apprentices capable of continuing their impossible work. This brings us to a logistical nightmare for the official narrative. When you map the distribution of these impossible figures, decorating the facades of buildings, constructed allegedly in the mid-1800s in Chicago, Melbourne, Paris, and St. Petersburg, the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. How did a supposedly disconnected world, relying on wind power, mud roads, and horse-drawn wagons, coordinate the mass production and global distribution of multi-ton fragile masterpieces without leaving a massive logistical footprint? We have more comprehensive documentation for the shipping of tea and spices than we do for the transport of these impossible stone monoliths. Consider the sheer volume and weight of these figures. We see them perched precariously on the cornices of post offices in provincial towns, staring down from the copper domes of state capitals and lining the grand avenues of cities that supposedly did not even have paved roads yet. The official story claims these were hoisted hundreds of feet into the air using wooden scaffolding and hemp ropes. Again, the math collapses. The localized stress on a wooden pulley system required to lift a 10-ton piece of brittle marble, balancing it perfectly to avoid snapping an extended arm or a delicate wing, is staggering. And they supposedly did this thousands of times, globally, without catastrophic failure. Furthermore, if millions of these statues exist globally, the sheer volume of displaced mountain rock should leave massive, unexplainable scars on the Earth, corresponding exactly to the timeline of the 19th century. Yet the old quarries do not reflect the mathematical volume of extraction required to build the global classical aesthetic from scratch in such a narrow window of time. Zoom in on the archival photographs of the Great World's Fairs, Chicago in 1893, St. Louis in 1904, Paris in 1900. We are told these vast neoclassical cities of domes, spires, and countless statues were built in a matter of months as temporary exhibits, using a cheap mixture of plaster and hemp called staff. But look closely at the high-resolution images of the statues adorning those temporary pavilions. Look at the weathering. Look at the profound anatomical sorrow etched into their faces. Do those look like temporary plaster molds thrown together by rushed laborers? Or do they look like the ancient petrified inhabitants of a pre-existing city, temporarily rebranded for a public exhibition before being systematically destroyed? If we apply the inheritance theory, the impossible becomes logical. We did not carve these statues. We found them exactly where they stand. The global distribution is not evidence of a worldwide renaissance of superhuman stonecutters. It is the physical footprint of a unified global civilization, a Tartarian society that occupied all these lands simultaneously. The identical architectural styles and the uniform presence of these petrified figures across diverse continents suggest a shared culture and a shared catastrophe. What kind of event could cause this? We must speculate carefully. If we are looking at biology instantly transmuted to stone, we are looking at a manipulation of matter at the atomic or frequency level. Could it have been an atmospheric weapon? A catastrophic surge of the very etheric energy they harvested through their copper domes and spires? A global frequency event that targeted the crystalline structures of the body, freezing the inhabitants in their final moments of terror, grief, or mundane labor? Notice the poses. Not all of these figures are striking heroic classical stances. Many are slumped, crawling, weeping, or shielding their faces. They are tangled in nets, pushing against impossible weights, or clutching each other in despair. Why would an artist commission a multi-ton, wildly expensive block of marble just to spend years painstakingly carving an anonymous, terrified man suffocating under a net? It defies artistic logic. It defies economic logic. But it perfectly aligns with the forensic reality of a sudden, petrifying cataclysm. The official record asks us to believe in an impossible coincidence, a global outbreak of artistic perfection that defied physics, spanned continents, and vanished without a trace. But your eyes tell you a different story. The silence of these millions of figures, scattered across the old world and the new, speaks volumes. They are not decorations. They are the citizens of a lost age, frozen in stone, and left out in the open for anyone willing to truly look at them. How do you hide an exterminated population frozen in solid stone? You cannot simply bury them all. The logistical effort required to move millions of molten figures would rival the catastrophe itself. You cannot crush them into gravel without drawing the attention of the very populations you are trying to domesticate and control. So you employ a strategy of cognitive dissonance. You hide them in plain sight. You put a velvet rope around them. You hoist them onto heavy pedestals in the center of grand, newly inherited plazas. You label them art. You assign them the names of mythological figures, Pluto, Apollo, Venus, or simply weeping angel and nameless nymph. By merely changing the label on the brass placard, you fundamentally alter the psychological perception of the observer. The institutions of the new era did not need to destroy every single petrified inhabitant of the Tartarian realm. They simply needed to recontextualize them. They took the victims of an unimaginable localized or global cataclysm and turned them into the foundational masterpieces of the new Western civilization. But to successfully execute a historical erasure of this magnitude, you must control the paperwork. The official narrative relies entirely on a paper trail to validate its claims of artistic commission. Yet when an independent auditor attempts to trace the true provenance of these impossibly perfect figures, we run into a very specific, highly coordinated wall. The archives are missing. We are told the original ledgers, the shipping manifests, and the architectural drafts were lost in the great fires of the late 19th century. We are asked to accept the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the burning of Paris during the Commune, and the mysterious, simultaneous infernos that swept through Boston, Seattle, Melbourne, and San Francisco as tragic accidents of a world lit by gas lamps and careless citizens. But look at the archival photographs of the aftermaths. The buildings that burned to absolute white ash were often massive stone, brick, and masonry structures. Solid stone does not catch fire from a kicked lantern. These were the very buildings that housed the municipal records, the property deeds, and the historical registries. If a new ruling class stepped into the vacant, petrified cities of the Tartarian Empire, their first logistical necessity would be to sever the timeline. You must burn the old books. You must destroy the pre-1800 records that might explain what truly happened to the people who built the impossible copper domes and possessed the impossible anatomy now frozen in marble. You erase the old world to reset the clock. Let us look carefully at this 19th century reset window. I present this not as dogma, but as a logistical hypothesis, a mathematical deduction based on the physical anomalies left behind. Between 1850 and roughly 1920, the world underwent a radical, inexplicable demographic and architectural restructuring. This is the era of the orphan trains. We see historical documentation of hundreds of thousands of children, stripped of their family names and given new, generic identities, shipped across continents by rail to repopulate empty, fully built grand cities in the American West and across the globe. Why were there so many orphans all at once? Where were the parents? Simultaneously, we see the construction of the grand asylums, massive, palatial, architectural fortresses built supposedly to house a sudden, exploding population of the clinically insane. But what if they were not mad? What if these vast, inescapable institutions were holding facilities for the survivors, the ones who remembered the event, the ones who remembered the flash in the sky, the weaponized frequency, or the atmospheric etheric shift that turned their families, their neighbors, and their leaders into the very marble statues now decorating the hastily repurposed government buildings? To speak of such a thing in the new, tightly controlled world would guarantee an immediate diagnosis of insanity and a lifetime locked behind thick stone walls. The memory of the prior civilization was systematically institutionalized and buried. And what of the petrified figures that were too disturbing, too clearly anatomical, or too obviously locked in modern distress rather than heroic classical poses? They had to be disposed of. Consider the sheer volume of statues created for the world's fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We are told by the official narrative that millions of tons of a temporary plaster called staff were molded into breathtaking classical figures for a 6-month exposition, only to be systematically dynamited and pushed into artificial lakes when the fairs closed. Look at the logistics of that claim. What an incredibly efficient method for the mass disposal of unwanted evidence. If the new elite needed to clear out thousands of petrified Tartarian citizens, figures that could not be easily explained away as art, or that bore the grotesque marks of their sudden petrification, you gather them in a central location under the guise of an international cultural exhibition. You display them briefly to dazzle the newly resettled amnesiac population, and then you orchestrate a controlled demolition. You burn the fairgrounds to the ground. You bury the shattered marble in the mud and pave over it. The history books call it urban renewal and temporary architecture. The logistical reality looks forensically identical to a massive cleanup operation. Try to question this process. Try to ask the curators of our most prestigious museums to explain the mechanical impossibility of the chisel achieving zero-error translucency in a brittle medium. Try to petition material scientists to take deep, independent core samples of these specific, impossible statues to test for trace organic carbons, internal bone density anomalies, or irregularities in the crystalline lattice that would prove biological transmutation. The requests are universally denied. The institutions point to a single piece of paper, a supposedly salvaged commission contract written by a long-dead noble, and declare the matter permanently settled. They refuse to address the mechanical contradictions. They refuse to explain the biological perfection of the vascular systems frozen in the rock. The silence is deafening. The academic and historical institutions guard the narrative with a ferocity that betrays their profound insecurity. They operate as gatekeepers, not explorers. They surround these petrified anomalies with dim museum lighting, velvet ropes, and lengthy, distracting plaques detailing the supposed tortuous genius of the sculptor, actively directing the viewer's mind away from the physical impossibilities resting right in front of their eyes. They know that if the public truly stops to look, if we stop accepting the mandated label of art and start observing these figures forensically, the entire timeline of human history begins to unravel. The erasure was meticulously planned, the fires burned exceptionally hot, and the name changes were effective, but they could not destroy every piece of evidence. The stone remains, waiting for those willing to look past the lies. When you finally step back from the magnifying glass, when you stop analyzing the impossible physics of the chisels and the missing logistical ledgers, a different kind of reality begins to set in. It is not a reality of anger, but of a profound, overwhelming melancholy. If these figures are not the fictional products of 19th century artistic imagination, if they are indeed the petrified citizens of a global, unified Tartarian civilization, then we must confront the terrifying magnitude of what was stolen from us. We must look at the world we currently occupy and recognize it for what it truly is, a downgraded utilitarian simulation built on top of a buried paradise. We are told by the official narrative that we are standing at the absolute pinnacle of human evolution. We are taught to look back at the past as a time of mud, disease, and crude struggles for survival. But look closely at the modern world outside your window. We live in a society defined by artificial scarcity and aesthetic degradation. We are surrounded by brutalist concrete structures, glass boxes of planned obsolescence, and cities designed to induce stress and isolation. We are chained to centralized power grids, paying exorbitant fees for the basic privilege of electricity, burning ancient fossils to power machines that poison the very air we breathe. We toil for decades to afford shelter that is structurally inferior to the grand, abandoned asylums of the 1800s. We are exhausted, we are sick, and we are disconnected. This is the inheritance we have been told to be grateful for. Now look again at the petrified figures trapped in the marble. Look beyond the tragedy of their sudden, violent transmutation. Observe the absolute elegance of their existence before the reset. Look at the garments frozen against their skin. These are not the rough, utilitarian textiles of a struggling, primitive people. The stone captures mathematically perfect lacework, impossibly fine diaphanous silks, and intricate flowing designs that suggest a society entirely devoid of poverty, drudgery, or want. Look at their physical forms. The anatomy is universally robust, perfectly proportioned, and vibrating with a profound biological harmony. They represent a humanity operating at its absolute highest frequency. These were the people who utilized the ether. They lived in the impossibly grand cities we later claim to have built with horse-drawn carts. They walked through the massive, oversized doorways we now shrink beneath. They lived in a world where energy was pulled freely from the atmosphere through complex copper domes and towering geometric spires. Their architecture was not merely decorative, it was functional, designed to resonate with the human body, to heal, to uplift, and to harmonize. They existed in a state of frictionless abundance, and it was entirely erased. The true tragedy is not just that this magnificent global civilization was weaponized, dismantled, and turned to stone. The ultimate tragedy is that we, the survivors, the descendants of the orphans placed on those westbound trains, were systematically taught to forget them. We were handed the shattered, emptied remnants of their utopia and told we must pay rent to our new masters to live in the ruins. We look at their majestic atmospheric power stations and are told they are just pretty churches. We look at the very citizens of that lost world, the men and women trapped forever in crystalline silence, and we are told they are just imaginary characters carved for the amusement of idle aristocrats. We have been robbed of our birthright, downgraded to a lesser species of tenant farmers on a planet we were meant to steward in beauty. This is the great unseeing, the psychological barrier that the institutions guard with such terrifying ferocity. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the undeniable biological reality pulsing beneath the surface of the marble, the illusion of our modern superiority shatters completely. You can no longer look at a grand neoclassical facade without wondering who actually walked through those halls before the mud flooded the lower levels. You can no longer look at the intricately carved face of a weeping angel without feeling a profound, visceral grief for a future you were supposed to inherit, a future that was violently stolen. The world around you fundamentally changes shape. The official narrative dissolves into a thin, transparent lie, unable to cover the massive, undeniable truth staring blindly back at us from the pedestals of our own museums. You realize, with a chilling certainty, that you are an exile in your own home. You are wandering through an occupied graveyard disguised as a testament to human progress. We are not the masters of this realm. We are the amnesiac survivors, walking past our petrified ancestors every single day, completely unaware of the magnificent, abundant world they built and the terrifying silence that swallowed them whole. We walk through these grand museum halls and municipal plazas every day, passing beneath the vacant, unblinking stares of a civilization we were taught never existed. We look up at the impossible translucency of a marble veil, or the agonizing tension of a stone muscle pushing against an invisible weight, and we dutifully repeat the official narrative. We tell ourselves that this is merely the triumph of a man with an iron chisel and infinite patience, operating in a world of mud and horse-drawn carts. We accept the mathematical contradiction because the alternative is too vast, too destabilizing to comprehend. But the physical evidence refuses to remain silent. The sheer biological exactitude, the 0% error rate required to carve negative space into brittle crystalline structures, and the global, uniform distribution of these monoliths point toward a vastly different historical reality. We must ask ourselves what requires more blind faith, believing that a sudden, inexplicable, worldwide generation of superhuman artists defied the laws of material science and then vanished without leaving a trace of their logistical networks, or accepting that we are looking at the petrified remains of a world that was violently reset? If the inheritance theory holds true, then these are not statues. They are the ultimate archival record. They are the victims of a frequency event, an atmospheric weapon, or an etheric catastrophe that instantly transmuted living biology into solid rock. We are the amnesiac descendants, The hermit crabs occupying the grand, empty shells of the Tartarian Empire, meticulously trained by our modern institutions to ignore the pulsing veins and terrified expressions frozen in the stone. The coordination problem is impossible to ignore. The destruction of the pre-1800 records, the blazing infernos that perfectly cleared the old cities, and the sudden influx of orphan populations all point to a deliberate, surgical erasure of the human timeline. Who closed the ledger? Who decided to take the tragic, petrified remnants of a lost utopia and rebrand them as the foundational art of a lesser, downgraded society? I do not have all the answers. The true nature of the cataclysm remains hidden in the shadows of the 19th century reset window. The evidence is all around us, waiting for you to see it. If this video resonated with you, please like and share it to help break the algorithm's silence. Subscribe for the next part of the investigation. The truth is waiting.